Keir Starmer's new cabinet doesn't contain many surprises, and in nearly all the major departments, shadow cabinet members have kept on in their respective roles to become cabinet members. One exception is Emily Thornberry. She was Shadow Attorney General, but has been passed over for this man. Richard Hermer KC is a prominent lawyer who worked at Keir Starmer's old chambers, and his appointment appears to have been welcomed by the human rights community. That's in part because he has taken generally decent positions on Palestine. Hermer has been a strong critic of Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. He's given evidence against the anti-BDS bill in Parliament, and in October, he told LBC this: "In respect to the siege, it is important to understand the context here. Gaza is called the Gaza Strip because it is a very small strip of land with over 2 million people crowded into it, nearly half of whom are children. Sieges have been used and identified as part of international law for a long time. Sieges per se of military personnel might not be contrary to international law, but it is almost impossible to conceive of how a siege that deprives a civilian population of the basic necessities of life is in compliance with international law." So he's saying very clearly now, the siege on Gaza, there's no way that can be legal in international law. Now, compare that answer to the person he has replaced.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
Of course, Emily Thornberry in that interview was defending an equally egregious statement by Keir Starmer. So presumably she didn't lose her job because of it. And probably that was because she briefed that Keir Starmer was boring, or that's what I'm led to believe. Of course, that all means we'll wait to see whether Hermer's appointment represents any genuine shift on the question of Palestinian rights. Another appointment which has been broadly welcomed is that of James Timpson as Minister for Prisons. James Timpson is the founder of the Timpson chain, and which offers dry cleaning, key cutting and shoe repairs. But it's not the services the chain offers that is notable, but rather who it employs, 10% of whom are former prisoners. And the firm is generally known for its social principles. This is a common sign outside its shops. If you are unemployed and need an outfit cleaned for an interview, we will clean it for free. So again, a good sentiment. He says, when times are tough, we will help you look your best. So fairly impressive guy. Timpson was also, until his appointment, chair of the Prison Reform Trust. And earlier this year, he explained his philosophy on prisons to Krishnan Guru Murphy.
We're addicted to sentencing. We're addicted to punishment. So many of the people who are in prison, in my view, shouldn't be there. A lot should, but a lot shouldn't. And they're there for far too long. Far too long. And that's just getting worse and worse. I meet people in prison regularly who are serving sentences longer than they've ever been alive for already. And I just think it's just, this is common sense being ignored, evidence being ignored, because there is this sentiment around punish and punish.
How would you change that?
I would just look at the evidence. So let me give you an example in Holland, which I know lots of people like to use the Dutch as an example. They've shut half their prisons, not because people are less naughty in Holland, it's because they've got a different way of sentencing, which is community sentencing. So people can stay at home, keep their jobs, keep their homes, keep reading their kids' bedtime stories. And it means that they're far less likely to commit crime again.
I mean, it's a cultural thing around punishment, isn't it? That we are kind of stuck in a sort of a Victorian mindset.
Yeah.
In a way. You've done something wrong, therefore you must pay the price.
Yeah, and a custodial sentence is not always the right thing for people. I mean, in very crude terms, and you'll get people who completely disagree with me on this, we have 85,000 people in prison. It's going to go up to 100,000 pretty soon. A third of them should definitely be there. There's another third in the middle, which probably shouldn't be there, but they need some other kind of state support. A lot of them have got massive mental health issues. They've been in prison, in and out of prison all their lives. And then there's another third, and there's a large proportion of women. Prison is a disaster for them because they're just putting them back in the offending cycle.
What to do about Britain's prisons is actually one of the first big calls Keir Starmer will have to make. The prison estate is set to reach full capacity on the 1st of August, which could trigger the early release of up to 40,000 inmates. In his first Downing Street press conference on Saturday, Starmer said his overall philosophy was that Britain has too many prisoners, but not enough prisons. So essentially sort of saying, I will build more prisons because we need more space, but then let's put fewer people in them. I suppose, more prisons and less prisoners is better than more prisoners and fewer prisons, which is what the Conservatives have offered. Ash, we'll talk about some other appointments in a moment. First of all, on these two, they do seem interesting and to some degree promising.
You know what? I feel really bad about something. Because when Richard Hermer was announced in the Attorney General role, I hadn't slept and I was delirious and finding the stupidest stuff funny. And because I saw a bald man wearing glasses, my brain immediately went, Greg Wallace. And then as soon as the idea struck me that Greg Wallace had been appointed Attorney General, that was gone. I was thinking about how Labour were appealing to their buttery biscuit base. I was thinking, law doesn't get tougher than this. I really went for it. So I'm sorry that was my first and only comment about Richard Hermer being appointed.
Distinguished lawyer, Ash.
I know. But you know what? I hadn't slept for a really, really long time. I think with these two appointments, again, the James Timpson stuff is really interesting. He falls into that camp of people who liberal reformers really love because he is essentially a liberal reformer. Now, that's not me saying it in a snide way. I think that the prison system, the criminal justice system, really could do with a lot of liberal reform. What we have had in this country is a crackdown model, which I think weakens the sort of social bonds which are capable of preventing crime and other forms of disorderly antisocial behaviour as much as they operate as a punishment and a deterrent. We've got absolutely terrible recidivism rates in this country, and that's when you compare it to other Western European countries, particularly in Scandinavia. They've got a completely different approach. The idea of having someone like James Timpson, sorry to bring it back to my 2 columns, Michael, but that's a cheap reform. It's a very cheap reform indeed. And Richard Hermer, look, he's eminently qualified, certainly qualified for the job, but there's a political calculation being made here too. I think about the pettiness of political operators. I think the fact that Emily Thornberry may or may not have been briefing against Keir Starmer, calling him boring, and perhaps trying to position herself for a leadership run, when Keir Starmer was looking quite weak, when, Labour had lost that Hartlepool by-election. That's the kind of thing that Starmer and his team will have a long memory for. And that's how things work. You know what they say, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. It's just a shame that after Emily Thornberry completely debased herself, defending Keir Starmer's absolutely atrocious comments, defending the collective punishment of Gazan people, which we now know has resulted in genocidal acts. That wasn't even enough to secure her a job in a government. I thought it was sort of embarrassing, that statement, when she was like, disappointed and surprised, translation, mega pissed. So yeah, embarrassing for her. Real shame.
And it's especially, well, it's not a shame, but it's especially embarrassing because she's got no one on her side now, right? The Keir Starmer allies think she's a bit duplicitous and was, ready to sort of try and overthrow him at the first sign of weakness. And anyone on the left, critics of Keir Starmer, think she's a complete sellout because she went on television and said it's okay for Israel to collectively punish 1 million kids in Gaza. To defend Keir Starmer, who now has said that's not good enough, right? You still want it to topple me when times are tough. So yeah, I suppose you need to be loyal to someone in politics, and I suppose Emily Thornberry has probably only been loyal to herself, and it hasn't turned out very well. Not all of Starmer's appointments have been as inspired as the ones we've just talked about. Some give his new government a more retro flavour. The International Development Secretary under Gordon Brown, Douglas Alexander, has been appointed as a business minister, and former Home Secretary Jackie Smith will join the House of Lords to become a higher education minister. Smith's elevation to the Lords is controversial and has been opposed by, amongst others, Jackie Smith. In 2012, Smith told Question Time viewers she was a disgrace and shouldn't be made a peer. That was due to her role in the expenses scandal. In 2010, it was found Smith had declared her main property was a house she shared with her sister in London, which allowed her to claim tens of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' cash for her family home in Worcestershire. Another new Labour stalwart set to be brought back into the fold is Alan Milburn, who will help Wes Streeting implement NHS reform. Milburn was and remains a strong supporter of the private sector having an expanded role in the health service. Ash, we discussed some sort of inspired appointments. These ones are very much, Blair reloaded.
I mean, I think this is where you can see the sort of anti-democratic turn that liberalism has taken, because nobody voted for reheated Blairism. I mean, that's certainly not something which is particularly popular amongst the electorate. And, neither Alan Milburn or Jackie Smith have been elected in this parliament. And so in order to sort of have this zombie-like resurrection of that, right-wing Labour project, you have to turn to, non-democratic means to get these people into your government. I mean, look, Jackie Smith saying, "Look, I'm disgraced. I shouldn't be in the House of Lords," and then being in the House of Lords and being brought back into the Starmer project. I mean, that sort of speaks for itself in terms of the hypocrisy of politicians. They come out with all these fine principles when it serves them and is politically advantageous in one moment, and then they ditch them the next. I mean, so far so Brownite. But I think Alan Milburn is the really interesting one here. He was a real ideological bedfellow of Tony Blair, one of those leading lights of the Blairite project. He first came to Parliament in 1992. His constituency, Darlington, was right next to Tony Blair. They were close. They worked really closely together. And after his time as an MP, when he was no longer in the government, he spent a lot of time sort of, first floating around this like centre-left, centre-right position. There were all these rumours that David Cameron was going to appoint him to the Lords so then he could bring him into his coalition government. They never manifested, but that tells you something about how he was being perceived at the time. And up until very recently, his job was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he was advising the firm on how they could make the most out of, and I quote, the UK healthcare market. These aren't positions either held by, Jackie Smith or Alan Milburn, which are popular amongst the electorate. I mean, that's probably why they're not MPs anymore. And I think that it's another way in which, in order to restore Blairism to the highest echelons of the Labour Party itself has had to bypass democratic means. I think there's a PhD in that somewhere. If only I could be bothered to write it.